Welcome to the third in our explorations of the collection of the Very Reverend William McMillan Library. Now, it is a marvellously rich and diverse collection, and amongst the items we hold are a large number of images, including many photographs, many Victorian and Edwardian photographs, particularly connected with our denomination. Typically we have things like carte de visite, which were a very popular form of photograph in the 1860s, and then cabinet photographs, which were a bit bigger and came on a bit later. And then also things like postcards, which are always interesting. We have a lot of visual items that tell us quite a bit about the history, and we'll be looking at those in these videos as we go along. But two items which we hold, which are very similar, are very visual, and they would fall into the category that's usually described as ephemera. That is, bits and pieces of printed material usually that weren't expected or weren't designed to last. And these were something that were made and published in the 1920s, and they weren't made to last, so they're now very rare. Now, to look at these items, we've had to come over to the session room where we store a lot of material. We also need the session room table because these are large items and we need somewhere to lay them out so we can have a good look at them. Now, these two items are calendars produced by the Rev Dr A.L. Agnew for the York Street Church in the 1920s. In the 1920s, Dr. Agnew was a great innovator, and York Street was a very outgoing and active congregation. And they produced these calendars to sell around the denomination, partly as a way of raising funds for the church, and also as a way of publicising the denomination. So here they are, the two calendars, one produced in 1924, one produced in 1925. And you can see they're quite large. They must have hung in pride of place in many a vestry or church hall, and people will have looked at them and been able to see pictures of all the churches in our denomination in 1924 and 1925. But because they were ephemera, they were only meant to last a year, I would imagine 99% of them were thrown away when they were taken down at the end of the year. What else do you do with an old calendar but throw it away? So that means they're very rare these days. I know of only 3 other copies in existence. I'd be interested to hear if you know of any more, to be honest, because I suspect the total number that are still in existence is quite probably less than a dozen. And here in Dunmurry we have 2 very nice examples. They are quite fragile now, but they tell us a lot about our denomination in the 20s and about how we saw ourselves. Each calendar contains a little section on non-subscribing principles, as well as details of the organisation of the church, a couple of references to some of the charities that the denomination still depends upon, and some organisations connected in those days with the synod. It's interesting also because we can see some churches, some church buildings which no longer exist, and we can also see how some other churches have changed and how some have stayed quite resolutely the same. We can see a little indication of how we were attempting outreach in those days. On the 1925 calendar, there's a little box, no picture, no photograph, but a little box telling us about the Bangor congregation founded in 1924. Yes, a congregation was founded in Bangor which met in Thompson's tea rooms, an attempt to extend our witness to the town of Bangor. And I think it lasted a few years through the 1920s. But let's have a look at some of the images, some of the churches that appear on the calendar. I think there's only one church that appears both in 1924 and 1925 as a photograph, and that's Antrim. Of course, the building's still there today, but it's now closed, and we can see the exterior, and also a slightly strange picture of the interior. Now this image was sold and was available to buy in those days as a postcard, and curiously it has a picture of John Abernethy cut out and superimposed over the pulpit. A church no longer with us, a good example of that would be the Belfast Domestic Mission. This building, the Domestic Mission, was founded in 1853, and the building was damaged in the war and I think finally destroyed during the Troubles. So the Belfast Domestic Mission still does exist as a grant-making body. Another church which exists but which no longer meets in its original meeting place is Ballymoney. Now the building is still there, or at least the facade, but this is a really interesting and I would say quite rare photograph of Ballymoney, and it looks quite an imposing church in its heyday in the 1920s. Some churches look more or less the same. So here we have a picture of Dunmurry, which apart from some of the trees hasn't changed at all, or a picture of the interior of Ballyclare, which looks exactly the same as it does today. I think when he made this, Dr. Agnew will have collected printers' blocks from various printers, probably from the people who published the non-subscribing Presbyterian, and used those. Although some of these photographs are a good deal older than the 1920s. So this picture of Downpatrick dates, I think, from just before the turn of the century. And it's interesting to see how much ivy covered the building at the time. And quite a few churches have a lot of ivy on them. Cumber also is noticeable for the amount of ivy climbing up the side. Although the champion ivy grower has to be Warren Point, which seems to have ivy along the whole length. Another interesting small photograph is that of Cork, the interior as it looked throughout most of the 20th century, with the pulpit and the organ, which was still there until relatively recently. And of course, sadly, in very recent times, Cork has had to face some even more serious challenges. But that's the interior of Cork in the 1920s, in the time of the Rev W.A. Weatherall. Then there's an interior of York Street, which is the church that made these calendars, and it's quite an interesting picture of York Street, again somewhere that was destroyed in the Blitz. But most of the churches on the calendars are, just as they are today, testimony to the continuing witness of our denomination. But two interesting items in our collection here, literally ephemera, pieces that weren't meant to last and so often haven't survived, yet we have an example of both of the calendars made by Dr. Agnew in the 1920s in York Street.